Thank you, Molly. Good evening, everyone, and great to be with you tonight. I hope you found Summit 17 to be a very, very valuable conference, and I have to say that more than anything, I love the name for its synergies with my own life. Before I get into try to draw some analogies between what I've done and perhaps what you're doing here, may I ask how many of you went along and saw this movie called Everest and about a big disaster on Mount Everest some years ago when a bunch of teams got into trouble in a big storm and came to grief? Show of hands. Yeah, quite a few of you. Well, that's great. It wasn't a bad film, and it wasn't a bad portrayal of the actual events on the mountain. Oh yes, good drama. And as I say, it actually wasn't too bad a representation of what went on. There was certainly a fair degree of Hollywood in there. But apart from that, it was an interesting lesson in, I would say, some questionable leadership decisions, and more than anything, in disengaged teams. And that expedition and the other expeditions at that time and many since have followed a very traditional way of climbing the mountains. They've taken a very fixed process to wear down the ultimate goal in incremental steps, using a very fixed strategy, fixed infrastructure, fixed camps, fixed plan. And those expeditions actually, before they arrived at the mountain, had a fixed date in mind for when they would summit the mountain, which is surprising. Heavily process-oriented and successful in conditions where the environment is predictable and obstacles are known or anticipated. But it's a very inflexible way to approach a big goal and a particularly dangerous situation. And particularly, it doesn't develop skills or capability or resilience in the members of the teams that go along on those expeditions. So when that environment changed, and it changed in that the storm came in early, it was forecast, but it came in early and caught them a little bit unawares, and they didn't have enough rope, and their climbers were slower than they should have been on the day. The leaders, because they didn't have that flexibility and the adaptability within themselves, stuck doggedly to their plan. And the members who were so disengaged and didn't have the capability, the inherent resilience, and the mindset to try and dictate the outcome, to assist in dictating the outcome, followed blindly along. And as a result, 8 people on that expedition died in one night. In fact, 8 people from 3 expeditions died in one night. And the reality is that mountaineering is a constantly evolving environment. All the mountains are different, but the same mountain can vary from year to year with different snow conditions and ice conditions, different climatic conditions, crevasses opening up and closing, and avalanches occurring. And in this advent now of commercial climbing, guided climbing on these big mountains, there are more and more people with less and less skills appearing on the mountains. So it's an environment of constant uncertainty and adversity, and it requires great adaptability and a willingness to embrace uncertainty, or people are going to get into big trouble. And it particularly requires resilience and individual engagement in the task that they're setting out on. Well, my journey to climb these mountains was more than just a lesson in climbing big lumps of rock and ice. Or as much fun as that was, it really was an education in people, myself included, on what engages us and keeps us motivated in challenging and changing environments, and the benefits of putting people ahead of process as we develop our teams to take on big challenges. And it's some of those learnings that Molly mentioned in her introduction that I'd like to share with you today. So just briefly, the mountains that I'm talking about are not the 7 summits. They're not the highest peak on each of the 7 continents. Kosciuszko, of course, is one of those. And as challenging as it is, it's not quite up there with the 8,000-metre peaks. All the 8,000-metre peaks live in South Asia, in the Greater Himalaya and Karakoram ranges, just north of India there. How did I come to be climbing those big mountains? Well, I wasn't a natural athlete at school, but I was very fortunate to be introduced to scouting. And again, as Molly mentioned, I was a cub in Brisbane at First Ascot, and then when my family moved to New South Wales, I joined First Pymble as a scout, and then we moved again, and so I then joined First Kalara. In fact, I still have my First Kalara scarf from all those years ago. And I was very, very fortunate because we were an active unit, and we were encouraged to get out and set ourselves big challenges, but particularly to have the autonomy and responsibility for doing the planning and the preparation And whilst we had oversight from our leader, we were encouraged to get out there and do that ourselves. And we were encouraged to run the trip ourselves with his oversight and guidance, but always with a high degree of autonomy, which gave us fabulous ownership of the outcome, but it also forced us in our planning to identify the potential obstacles and prepare for them, always being prepared, which developed in us great resilience for when we met those obstacles or unanticipated obstacles that we came across. End of One Challenge also just became the starting point for the next big challenge. And as we completed one challenge we thought would be the best we'd ever done, and it was, then we go, right, now what can we do? And we'd start planning for an even bigger one and keeping on going. It was a wonderful, wonderful introduction to outdoors, but also introduction to personal development and building resilience and that planning and preparation. Luckily for me, I found my niche, and that was the alpine world. And I discovered snow, and when I first went cross-country skiing, it was just such an incredible new environment for me, and I fell absolutely in love with it and knew that this was going to have a major effect on my life. And I went down as often as I could, but regrettably, after I finished Rovers and had to move out of scouting, I was looking for the next big goal in my life. And whilst plenty of people were making good suggestions about family and settling down and all that sort of thing, luckily for me, I saw a slideshow about climbing Mount Everest and thought, that's what I want to do. And it was in the days before one could be guided, so I had to learn how to climb. And so I took up rock climbing. I broke the overarching strategic goal of Everest into achievable chunks, learned to rock climb in Australia, here in the Blue Mountains, west of Sydney, then went to New Zealand and undertook an alpine climbing course and built my skills and experience over several years in New Zealand, and then on expeditions. And I can tell you that that photo is from an expedition to Denali, led by your very own CEO, Andrew Smith, who's here with us tonight. And as I built that broad-based application of skills and experience, it was all with a view to joining an expedition to Mount Everest. And in due course, I was invited to go to Mount Everest, but it was my first attempt on any 8,000-metre peak. And I can tell you it's exponentially higher and more difficult than a 6,000-metre peak. And when we were, in reality, somewhat unprepared, we made a few mistakes, we had a few accidents, and including one of which was where one of our team members was avalanched 1,000 metres down this face called the Lhotse Face. Luckily, we were climbing in the season that has the most snow on the mountain, so he had a relatively soft ride down the mountain. It took him about 30 seconds to be carried down. It spat him out at the bottom of the face and out onto the glacier, and he survived. Although surprisingly, he did lose interest in the climb, and our team of 4 was reduced to a team of 3. But that's okay. We made mistakes. We didn't get to the summit. My attitude has always been, it's not failure unless you give up. So I decided I'd come back and have another crack at the mountain, and I did. But regrettably, that wasn't successful either, and in fact, one of our team lost his life on that expedition in a fall. And that didn't stop me from climbing, but I thought I should step away from Mount Everest and go and develop my skills and experience on other 8,000-metre mountains so that I could come back and drive a successful and safe expedition on Mount Everest. But regrettably, my next expedition was K2, and whilst that was successful, it's the second highest peak in the world, 2 of our team of 4 were killed on descent from the summit of that mountain. And again, it didn't stop me from climbing, but I found that over the next few years, whilst I was going on other expeditions to other 8,000-metre peaks, there always seemed to be a reason to hold back, not to commit fully at the very last moment, on that day that we were going for the top. And after 6 expeditions, I stopped and I looked at myself and said, I need to do a bit of a self-review here, because it was a very costly activity, and it was costly in terms of finances and career and relationships. And whilst I had become, I guess, to a certain extent, a technical expert at climbing, I wasn't being successful. And in that self-review, I realised that those deaths had eroded my motivation to a certain degree. And I was relying on success of the teams that I was joining to bring my personal success. Well, that was okay when those teams succeeded, but if they didn't, then I wasn't succeeding. And the primary element of motivation is purpose. So I had to step back and ask myself, was I really committed to the purpose of climbing these mountains and indeed climbing Mount Everest? Because if I wasn't, then I really shouldn't be in that game. It was so costly and it was so dangerous. But the thought of giving up mountaineering and not continuing on to Everest was abhorrent to me. And I realized that I really did want to do it. I just had to commit and not allow myself to lose my motivation and be distracted from my ultimate goal unless the risk was too high. And of course, it's always about responsible risk taking, or it was simply beyond my technical ability, and that would be okay. So with that newfound attitude that I was absolutely committed to my purpose, I believed in the purpose, I joined an expedition to this mountain called Dhaulagiri. And I was in the Army Reserve at the time, and this was actually a military expedition for the Army Alpine Club. It was a big team, quite a mix of skills, as is normal in workplace and most groups, scouting in particular. And the idea was that we would try and make the first ever Australian ascent of that mountain, but also develop the skills of the less experienced members on the team, and so enhance the overall capability of the Army climbing corps. Well, like any expedition, we were strung out climbers needing money, and we asked all sorts of agencies for sponsorship. And the airline that flew us over there, the ladies in the office agreed that they would support us with discounted excess baggage if we would give them a photo of ourselves lined up from base camp. So we duly stood up for all our sponsors and took photos for the people in the office. But this is not the photo we gave the ladies in the airline office, though. This is the photo we gave them. Signed copies are available with the book at the end of the presentation. In any case, Dhaulagiri means mountain of storms, and it lived up to its reputation. It's such an incredibly windy mountain. And when it wasn't blowing, it was snowing. And we found ourselves constantly climbing in these exhausting conditions with meters of snow dumping at a time. But the biggest issue wasn't the terrible conditions which were really wearing us down. It was the leadership approach where the leader decided he would climb in a very traditional way, much like that commercial expedition that I spoke about at the beginning of my presentation. We had a very fixed plan, fixed camp. So as we climbed up, we'd establish a camp fully stocked with tents and supplies, and then a camp fully stocked with tents and supplies at Camp 2, and so on and so forth. But in this terrible weather, those camps constantly were destroyed by the snow and the wind, and we'd have to climb back up to re-establish those camps. And we spent all our time repairing the lower camps and reinstalling the camps, just maintaining the status quo on the mountain rather than advancing further up the mountain towards the summit. And we knew, many of us in the team knew that the way to climb this mountain was to adapt our climbing style to a very light and fast style that we call a capsule style, where we just take one tent per team of climbers and carry that tent with us all the way up the mountain, and hardly use any rope, travel light and fast. But we didn't have the autonomy to adapt, because our leader required us to stay in this very fixed process. And not only did that hamper our progress, but it really destroyed the motivation in the team. Of course, at some point, there is a place for a rope, and that's a good thing. The other aspect of the expedition that caused us problems was that while we were split into two teams, with the original idea being that one team would go up and start opening the route, and then as they came down to rest, the second team would go up and do the same. It actually morphed into a situation where the stronger climbers were in the lead team and opening the route and having the fun on the mountain, exploring the way up and overcoming the technical obstacles. And that is the fun of climbing. But the less experienced people were put into the support team and just bringing up more tents and more ropes and performing a secondary role, which was not good for their morale. And after a fair while on the mountain, where we were so exhausted and really only getting about halfway up the hill, we had a team meeting. And the support team revealed that they just didn't feel valued or equal in this expedition, in this process, and that they didn't believe that they were going to get a chance at the summit. And as a result, they had no sense of purpose in the expedition and lost interest, just weren't engaged. And 70% of our expedition quit on the spot and went home. That's a dreadful situation, because they lost their opportunity, but they'd come in with such high hopes, and they'd had those taken away from them. So whilst the remaining four of us, and which then became three, continued on, we lost, as I say, 70% of our team. But ironically, that loss of support obliged us to change our ways, and the leader of the expedition actually then understood that he needed to allow us to adapt to the changing conditions and if we would have any hope on the mountain. And he then gave us the autonomy to adapt our processes to suit the operating environment. And what that meant was we then did, in fact, have a very mobile style. We didn't try and keep replacing broken tents on the mountains. We just carried one little tent between us and went as light and fast as we could up the mountain. And that worked in the conditions, and we started to progress. And that autonomy provided us with huge motivation. But also, we adapted our internal processes to meet the conditions as well. And I was probably the more technical climber in the team, probably had more experience. And so I tended to go ahead and find the way and overcome the technical obstacles ahead of the other guys, whilst one of the other chaps, Matt, is stronger than I am and more powerful, and he carried a heavier load. And so he was able then to let me lighten my load so I could go ahead and overcome the obstacles, and he took the bigger load, and the third guy brought up the equipment that we placed as we climbed, and he brought that up, and then we adapted our process. So what we were doing was working to our strengths and our complementary skill sets. And as you all know, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And as a result of climbing in this way, the team became really, really strong. And it was incredibly empowering because we had, firstly, the camaraderie of shared adversity. And from time to time, we did still experience significant adversity. I managed to get myself fully buried in an avalanche in the tent, but the other guys didn't dislike me too much. And so they buried me out, dug me out, which was nice. And we were able to then keep on climbing. But that really strong camaraderie made those obstacles seem like much less than they really were. And as we climbed up and were starting to enjoy climbing in this style where we were working to our strengths with a good degree of autonomy, the goal morphed from the summit, and that, of course, was still the end goal, but it morphed into the journey and having a really good climbing experience as we worked to those strengths and we progressed up the mountain and really saw the mountain start to drop away underneath us, and that was fantastic. And we really became a highly capable team who took ownership of the outcome, and that is mastery, and that is the next element of motivation. If you have mastery, if you have the skills, but you have the ownership of the outcome, that's incredibly motivating. And as we climbed up, in due course, with a few more obstacles, we did in fact reach the summit. Just three of us, we reached the summit, and it was the first Australian ascent of the mountain. And it's a pretty amazing summit, that one. We reached it at 9 o'clock at night. There's a 7,000 metre drop off that side of the mountain. It's the largest drop between any point in any valley on Earth, and we were keen not to explore that. So we took it very, very carefully along the ridge, but we were successful. We spent 3 minutes on the top, took one photo, and then hightailed it out of there. But the success was due to absolute commitment to the purpose, but the team and the team members finally getting the autonomy to adapt to the conditions and getting that mastery, allowing ourselves to work to our skills, our complementary skill sets, and understanding the value that each of the team members had within that team rather than sticking to a rigid process. The only really disappointing thing out of that expedition was that so many more of the team could have reached the summit had we adopted that style of climbing from the outset. So it was a really big lesson to me. But after that, I did in fact start to become quite successful. I continued over the next few years climbing more 8,000 metre peaks, and on each occasion I reached the summit of those peaks. But eventually, that brought me back to my old nemesis, Mount Everest. Things had changed though. When Everest was first climbed in 1953 by Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay, success in those days, it was one person getting to the summit. That was success for the entire team, all the supporters, and indeed the nations that those people represented. Then after that, the next era was the teams like I had been in my early climbing days, where we were teams of peers with skills that we hoped would be enough to get us up the mountain. But we worked together, and we had these complementary skill sets to get ourselves to the top and back down again safely. But by the time I came back, the environment had changed. Firstly, the cost to go to Mount Everest had changed, so the peak fee, which was $3,000 the first time I went there, and $10,000 the second time I went there, just for the piece of paper. By the time I came back, it was $70,000 for the piece of paper, just the permit. And on top of that were all the expedition expenses. Well, as an impoverished climber, I had no money, and I could not afford to do that. So I actually had to take a job leading one of these guided expeditions, a commercial expedition. Now, there's a real difference between the commercial expeditions and Hillary's day and even my early days, because in this situation, the clients are basically a group of individuals with not too much experience, certainly varying skills and experience. They all want to reach the summit. They've all paid large sums of money to get to the summit, but they all feel highly intimidated because it's an environment that they do not have great skill in. It's an uncertain environment for them. And uncertainty breeds disengagement, accidents, and underperformance. And do you remember that video that I showed at the very beginning where the chap was talking about his motivation to follow his dreams? I'll just show it to you again.
It hurts. It's dangerous. Why? I have kids. They see a regular guy can follow impossible dreams. Maybe they'll do the same.
And there's nothing wrong with following your dreams, but unfortunately, he entered an environment in that guided situation where all he was allowed to do was follow. He wasn't a strong and contributing member to the team. He was intimidated and uncertain, but he was offered no chance to develop his capabilities and affect the outcome of the expedition. So basically, he had no emotional engagement. He wasn't invited to take part in the planning or the preparation of the expedition, the decision-making of the expedition. He just followed along when the work was done and hoped to get to the top. But by not being valued as a critical member of the expedition, he was disempowered of his ability to affect the outcome of the expedition. He had no understanding of the challenges, the potential obstacles that he would face. He had no inherent resilience or adaptability, and he had no ability to cope with unanticipated obstacles. So when it went wrong, and it did, it went catastrophically wrong because the leaders of the expeditions on that night, the leaders died. And the members of the team who then had no inherent ability to affect the outcome, they followed on blindly, and 8 members from 3 different expeditions. So this wasn't one expedition with one peculiar leadership style. It was the way of doing business in those days. 8 members over 3 expeditions died in one night. And I can tell you that on average, on Mount Everest, ever since that expedition, every year on average, 7 climbers die. So what's been learned? Not much. So when I came along to this mountain, and it was my turn to lead an expedition, whilst it was clear that individual success could only come through the broader organisational success, it was much more significant to me as leader that the organisation was only ever going to succeed if the individuals were themselves empowered and capable to climb the mountain. And if I thought I was going to drag inexperienced clients up this mountain without really developing them to an extent where they could really input to the expedition, then I was kidding myself, and it was either going to end in disaster or worse. So it was my responsibility to get their clients to understand their critical value in this expedition, in this attempt on the mountain, and to develop them into being capable and motivated and enough to contribute to their own success. And the first part of that was to change the culture of commercial expeditioning within our team. And the traditional leadership approach on those guided expeditions was to have very distinct units within the guided expedition. So there was the leadership team, there was the team of clients, and then there was the Sherpa team who did most of the work of carrying the ropes and supporting equipment up the mountain. Well, my focus was one summit, one team. And my intent was to build a very strong collaboration across all sectors of the expedition. So the Sherpa team, from the outset, we weren't going to treat them as the support crew, nor were they the elite crew. They were a very valued component of the expedition. And the clients weren't the rich sahibs, nor were they to be favoured in any way. They were an integral component of the expedition. And from the outset, I invited the Sherpas and the clients to take part in all the planning and the preparation. And that was very unusual for Sherpas, because normally they're just told, well, there's the gear that needs to get up the mountain, get that to Camp 1, that to Camp 2, and so on and so forth. They go away and do it, but they don't contribute to the planning of how the rest of the team is going to get up the mountain and how the clients might support the Sherpas or the Sherpas might support the clients. So they really enjoyed being a part of it. And of course, these guys work in that environment so much. They had a depth of knowledge which was invaluable for us in our planning and preparation. But then I also included the clients in that planning and strategizing and the risk management approach, because I wanted their perspectives. I wanted them to understand, firstly, the sort of things that we might have to encounter, but I wanted their input as well, and I needed to understand what their skills were and their strengths were. And I also required them to assist with the carrying of the equipment up the mountain. Now, these guys had paid $50,000 each to be guided up the mountain, and they were expecting to have a very light pack and follow up a big trail. But I didn't want that. I wanted them to understand the work the Sherpas were doing so they could then understand the obstacles and the challenges that the Sherpas would face. I didn't require them to carry everything up the mountain, but to engage and have this cross-team, cross-expedition collaboration. Because sharing tasks in that way creates really meaningful engagement for all the parties, and they start to understand. It's all about sense-making. They understand the purpose behind many of the decisions made, and they understand the obstacles and the challenges and the risks, and they start to take ownership of that as they contribute to the decisions as to how we're going to overcome those obstacles. So it was absolutely integral to get them involved in the planning. The shared ownership of the goal, absolutely fantastic. And then the resilience builds because they understand the obstacles that we're going to face. It also allowed us to identify the individual strengths so that we could determine who would do what as we climbed up the mountain and let them perform to their best, still within the team environment. Certainly I was the leader and I had the responsibility, and I took ultimate responsibility for the decision making, but I gave them as much autonomy as I could to work to those strengths and develop the team in a nice, strong way. And doing all of that, what it did most importantly was it built respect for each other across the team, because they started to understand each other's strengths and weaknesses and started to trust in each other. Trust is such an important component. And I can tell you respect is absolutely the most important component. You can't always have harmony. We're all individuals. We do see things different ways. But if you can get respect across the team, so you at least understand people's strengths and weaknesses, the team becomes very strong. And as a result of doing all this, the team became emotionally engaged in the process of how we were going to climb the mountain. And that's what I absolutely needed. We can only talk about it for so long, and so in due course we had to start climbing. And when you climb these great big mountains, you break the strategic goal of the summit down into achievable chunks. And despite all the training we did before we went up the mountain and all this planning and cross-collaboration and all the rest, for these relatively inexperienced people, climbing Mount Everest was still a huge undertaking, incredibly intimidating. And whilst the end goal was the summit and safe return, I just got them to focus on the first stage, and that was to get to Camp 1. From base camp, you climb up through what's known as the Khumbu Icefall, probably the most dangerous part of the mountain because there's lots of ice cliffs that fall down, and those big accidents you've heard of in recent years have all occurred in that part of the mountain. And what you do is you climb up, and you get to Camp 1, and you drop a load of equipment, and then you actually climb back down again to base camp and pick up another load and go back up. And over a number of days, you do that, and you get your stores and equipment up to where you need it at Camp 1, by which time your body has adjusted to the higher altitude at which Camp 1 is located. So then you can occupy Camp 1 and start doing the same thing up and down to Camp 2. So we were training before we went up. We had our skills. We had our nice capability to allow us to go as quickly as possible up through this dangerous ground. This is going through the Khumbu Icefall. And that arch of ice there was once a great big block of ice, 5 times as big as this building. Huge blocks of ice that break away from the face of the glacier up near Camp 1. Gradually move down the steeper part of the glacier called the Khumbu Icefall. And they break up in this arch. Whilst it was there at the beginning of the expedition, was gone by the end of the expedition. And you don't want to be on a great big bridge of ice like that when it collapses. So you're motivated to move fairly quickly through that point. And then, of course, we got to the top of the icefall, and we had to overcome those great big blocks of ice before moving further up the glacier. And so we understood the challenges and the obstacles we'd face. We prepared for them, and we brought the equipment that we needed to overcome them. Of course, as you can see, we've got lots of lengths of aluminium ladder there tied together to allow us to go up and down over those great big ice cliffs. And just for a point of interest, you can see the lines in the ice there. Each of those lines represents 1 year's snowfall that's been crushed down, compacted down into ice over the eons. And so you can see how many years of ice are in there. And every 10 years or so, there was a drought. And so that brown layer is where there was more dust blown through the air, which settled on the ice. And it's a really good history of the conditions in the area. We, as I say, we anticipated the obstacles, we prepared for them, and we dealt with them as we needed to. Some of which could be circumvented, some of which had to be negotiated, but as we planned for them, we were prepared for them, and then as a team, we overcame those obstacles. You see that guy tiptoeing across a few ladders there, but supported by members of the team holding the ropes for him. And that's how we progressed. So up through the icefall to Camp 1, over those big ladders towards Camp 2, and over a number of weeks, and it takes about 6 weeks on Everest before you're ready to make an attempt on the summit as you establish your way up the mountain. So we advanced, and at every camp, what was absolutely critical was we'd stop. Whilst we didn't have a party, we still celebrated the achievement of reaching that next stage, because we ticked off the first goal of Camp 1, and then we'd set our sights on the next goal of Camp 2. But I got the team to recognise that in achieving Camp 1, firstly they'd reached an altitude record for themselves, but they'd also overcome technical obstacles that they hadn't ever experienced before. So their competence was increasing, and I needed them to recognise and celebrate that, because that then told them that they had more competence going on with the mountain, and that increased their motivation, so they would continue on with the climb and not get scared by the whole mountain and want to pull out. So we did that, and we continued up, and that's Camp 2 down there. This is climbing up to Camp 3. This is the point from which approximately my friend all those years before was carried off down the mountain in a small avalanche and fell 1,000 metres. So that's about 1,000 metres looking down there to the glacier. But we didn't fall down, we just kept on going up. As I say, after about 6 weeks, we were ready to make our summit attempt. We were getting weather forecasts and the conditions were great. We were in late May. We climbed from base camp up to Camp 1, Camp 2, Camp 3, Camp 4 on what's called the South Col. And because by this era there was commercial expeditioning, we weren't the only commercial expedition up there. There were 3 others going for the summit that night. Now I knew, and most people knew, that from the summit, from the South Col, Camp 4, up to the summit, one requires about 800 metres of rope to overcome the technical difficulties. Now, it's much longer than 800 metres to the summit, but if you have that much rope, you can at least put it where you need it most on the most dangerous bits. So I went and spoke to the leaders of the 3 other teams, and we agreed that between us we would carry the 800 metres of rope, with each team carrying their share being 200 metres of rope. It made good sense. We'd just leapfrog each team up the mountain the next day as we went for the summit, and we'd share the load of carrying the rope up, because at that extreme altitude, every gram is critical, and 800 metres of rope is very, very heavy. So everyone agreed to do that, and we set out around 10 p.m. from the South Col. That's Camp 4. It's a great big area on the mountain. We climbed up through the night, and the idea is that you climb up all the way to the summit, hoping to get there by about midday the next day. It takes that long, and then back down to your camp that evening. So it's about 21 hours of climbing. So we set out and we climbed our way up, and the first team put in its rope, and the second team put in its rope, and our team came up and we put in our rope, and we're getting up towards the South Summit there. And it was going really well. The forecast was accurate. It was a beautiful day. The team was strong. Each team had laid out its rope. It was absolutely fantastic, and I was thrilled, because not only did I think I was going to get to the summit myself, but I thought my team was going to get there, because they were all in great condition. It was just a really fabulous day. And we finally made it up to the South Summit there, which is at 8,750 metres. In altitude, it's just 100 metres lower than the summit of Mount Everest. It's a few hundred metres along the ridge. And as we reached that point, the 4th team came up, and we asked them to place the rope across to the summit. And this is the view from that point. You just drop down in a bit of a notch, up and over this sort of technical rock. That's the Hillary Step there, and then wander along the last few hundred metres along to the summit. So we asked that final team to come up and put the rope in, and they came up, And guess what? You've all heard the story before. They didn't have the rope. They didn't bring the rope. They had hoped that the rope carried by the other three teams, just 600 metres, would be enough to overcome all the obstacles that we would face. But we had used our 600 metres of rope to get to this point, and we didn't have any more rope to cross this last piece. Now, we couldn't go and retrieve the rope below because the issues with the altitude up there are that people can very quickly succumb to altitude and need to be carried quickly down the mountain. We need the rope in place to do that. So it was really a matter of could we climb the mountain from this point without the rope or not. Now, I can tell you that after all these years, it's been 15 years of me climbing on 8,000 metre peaks, I did in fact have the technical skills to scarper across without the rope. I suppose I could have said to the team, well, look, can you just hang here while I just pop across? I'll be back in a couple of hours, have a cup of tea or something. Or I suppose I could have gone, well, let's just try, if we lose a couple, that's just collateral damage, Or, of course, I could be an authentic leader and make the only possible decision, which was heartbreaking for absolutely everybody. But that decision was to turn them around at that point. Within 100 metres of the summit of Mount Everest, there was $1 million worth of expeditions up on the mountain on that day. And all of them were stuck with this dilemma. It was a terrible, terrible position to be in. But, of course, my responsibility as the leader of my team was to my team. And the team's bigger than just those climbers, those paying clients. The team was the Sherpas who were putting their lives on the line, and all the supporters halfway up the mountain, down in base camp, the family and sponsors and friends and all that sort of stuff, the greater organisation. My responsibility was to everyone, and I couldn't, in all conscience, proceed from that point. So I turned them around, and it was absolutely soul-destroying. And of course, some of the clients said, look, we'll go, we'll try it, we'll risk the collateral damage, but I couldn't do that. And ultimately, all the teams turned around from that point, and we climbed down. And over the next few days, we climbed all the way down to base camp. We couldn't just turn around at that point and go back up with another couple of 100 metres of rope, because when you've been so high, 100 metres below the summit is the same as the summit. It's so physically exhausting, even when you're using auxiliary oxygen, that you can barely walk up a flight of stairs. You just want to sleep for weeks, and it does take weeks to physically recover from being so high. Well, the one thing I did for my team at that point when I turned them around was I promised that I would give them another chance if they wanted it. So we got down to base camp, and the other three teams all imploded as they fought to blame each other for not getting to the summit. And quite honestly, I thought perhaps the team would have a go at me for not having reached the summit, because I can tell you in my risk management planning, whilst I'd anticipated we may not get to the summit the first time and I had enough oxygen and ropes for a second attempt, I had not envisaged that we get to within 100 metres to find that one of the supporting teams with us didn't bring their share of the equipment, because they lost as well. Anyway, what I found was I no longer had a group of intimidated individuals. I had a really empowered team. They absolutely were resilient because they'd taken part in the planning and understood that we would meet obstacles, anticipated and unanticipated. They'd shared the adversity of the climb to that point, and it had been adverse for them because it was all new, of going higher and higher on the world's largest mountain and overcoming all those obstacles. They had the attitude, they had the ownership of the outcome, because we developed the skills down low on the mountain before we started climbing, and then we worked together as a team. They had the autonomy. It was absolutely their decision if they wanted to go up, and they were so committed to the purpose of climbing this mountain that they wanted to go back up again. And I think if I'd said that I wasn't going to take them, they'd have gone without me. They were so empowered. So, of course, we decided that we would try again, and I honestly didn't know if we'd just go 10 metres up the Coombe Icefall and collapse with exhaustion. But if we had, that would have been okay, because at least we'd given it our best shot. And it was the most exhausting thing I've ever done. But gradually, one step at a time, we made our way back up to Camp 1 one day, and the next day to Camp 2, and so on and so forth. One step at a time, absolutely exhausted, carrying another 200 metres of rope, I might add. And got ourselves back up to the South Col, and then launched our second summit attempt on the mountain. And regrettably, it wasn't as beautiful a day as we'd had at the very outset, because the season for climbing was almost over. The monsoon was just about on us, and that's why we only had time for 2 days rest in base camp rather than the weeks that we really wanted. But we climbed back up, and the wind was blowing and howling, and in fact it blew so much ice-laden wind that our goggles frosted up, and we couldn't scrape the ice off the goggles with our mittens, so we had to take the mittens off. And then the cold, dry wind dried the moisture in our eyes, and we had to keep putting our gloves over our eyes to try and moisten them and thaw them out so we could blink and see what we were doing. That was a little bit tough, but it wasn't enough to stop us, and we kept on going. And would you believe it, one step at a time, we actually reached the summit of Mount Everest. And of course, it was success for me, and it was an absolutely fantastic experience. But it was success for the expedition, the broader organisation. And again, it was success not just for the clients, but for the Sherpas and the supporters and the family and everybody involved. And it was a wonderful feeling, and it was probably the most satisfying summit that I've ever had, seeing the team come together and develop into such a united and strong force in that way. Now, I'm not going to say that we jumped up and down on the summit. I'm not going to play you any motivating music at this time, because we really don't do that on the summit of Mount Everest. You climb down very gingerly and get on with your life. But what I realised is that going back to those early days in the Scouts, where we had always said the end of one project was just the starting point for the next project, for me, the summit of Everest became the base camp for my next project. And I then set my sights on climbing all the 8,000 metre peaks, which took another 9 years of climbing. And when I finally succeeded in that project, that just became the base camp for the next project. And that's another story. But I can tell you that giving my teams the support to emotionally engage and take ownership of the outcomes themselves, and getting them to, or making the experience about that journey rather than just the end goal, was a winning formula for me in getting multiple teams to succeed in whatever challenge it was. And I know that approaching your own challenges in that way will assist you to reach the summit of the goals that you're now facing. And I'd like to thank you for your time and wish you the very best in that. So thank you.